بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series Reflections on the Qur'an. In our last episode, we talked about what the Qur'an has to say about natural phenomena. And we mentioned that there were more than 750 verses in the Qur'an that either discuss natural phenomena or call upon people to investigate aspects of the world around them. And the implication of that is that world out there is real, it's temporary, and its existence is not absolute, but it is real, and it has lessons to teach us. And so empirical investigation of the world around us is a means of valid knowledge. So in this regard, the Qur'an is saying that there are two means of valid knowledge. There's investigation of the world around us, and there is the revelation itself. Now, this emphasis on empirical knowledge, a number of Islamic thinkers and philosophers have pointed out that that's a real fundamental difference from what was considered to be rational knowledge at the time that the Qur'an was revealed. The people who were supposed to be the pinnacle of rational thought in the ancient world were the Greeks. And their groundbreaking contribution at the beginning of the explosion of their intellectual activity was geometry. And geometry starts with some definitions. This is a point, this is a line. And then it starts with some axioms, proposals for which there's no proof. They're just so obvious that they're held to be true. And then from that, there's this process of deduction, argument, that if this is true, then in this situation, the following will also be true. And so the Greek approach to thought was deductive. And possibly also because the people who were doing that activity were from the upper class, the whole idea of getting your hands dirty was something that the lower classes did. So people who were philosophers and discussed issues of the world around them, they never really bothered to investigate whether some of those statements that they made about the natural world were indeed true. So what the Qur'an really did was lay down the foundations for another way of approaching the world, which is empirical investigation, which of the two main methods of using the mind in some systematic, rational way. That second is called inductive reasoning. And so that became a hallmark of Islamic civilization, and it was from the Islamic civilization that Europe got that outlook, that approach to investigating reality. Famously, Roger Bacon in the 12th century or the 1200s, English philosopher who was one of the early people to lay down some kind of glimmerings of a scientific method in Europe. He studied in the Spanish universities of his day because that's where the higher learning of that time would have been sought. Just like in our time, people go to England or the US in order to seek knowledge, cutting-edge knowledge, or maybe Japan. In those days, the cutting-edge knowledge, closest access to it if you were in Europe, was in Andalus, in Spain. Now, with regard to this dual sources of knowledge, the natural world around us and revelation, Taha Jabir al-Alwani, in my opinion, he's done some of the leading work in our time of trying to bring about some kind of a fusion between the Islamic epistemology, which is based upon usul al-fiqh. That's his area of specialization. He taught usul al-fiqh for many, many years at Jamiat al-Imam. And then he was associated with the International Institute for Islamic Thought in Herndon, Virginia. And then he moved to Egypt, which is, as far as I know, that's where he still lives. Now, he did the tahqiq, the editing and the commentary on Al-Razi's monumental work on usul al-fiqh known as Al-Mahsul. And so Dr. Alwani, Professor Alwani is, he has the usul al-fiqh background, and his writings also show an awareness of philosophy of science and lots of contemporary issues. So the kind of problems that he chooses to write about are, in my opinion, some of the most interesting and pressing problems of our time. So he wrote one little monograph called something about the two readings, the reading of the book of nature and the reading of the Revelation. And he made a statement in one of his writings: humanity has been commanded to undertake two kinds of readings and to understand its situation in the universe through an understanding of how the two complement one another. The first reading is the book of Allah's revelation, meaning the Qur'an, in which all matters of religious significance are explained. And the second is the book of His creation, the natural universe, from which nothing has been omitted. To undertake a reading of either without reference to the other will not lead to the sort of comprehensive knowledge necessary for the building and maintenance of civilized society. So he is not denying the great contribution of Muslim scholars who focused on the Qur'an, the legacy that they have bequeathed us of knowledge of the revelation. But in the world in which we live, we also need to acknowledge that there is rapidly expanding knowledge about the world around us. I mean, it's a kind of knowledge that's increasing exponentially because there's thousands upon who knows how many people are specialized in one area or another, and every one of them is studying this whole, some tiny aspect of the way the world is put together and the way the world works. A lot of that has implications for our understanding of life. So we need to take consideration of it, and then calls for some kind of a methodology for how to deal with the two things and how to reconcile apparent contradictions between them. Now, this whole idea of there being two books, a revealed book and the book of nature, is not unique at all to Islamic society. Francis Bacon, who was one of the, his last name is Bacon, but he was centuries after Roger Bacon. I believe he lived in the 17th century. So he's considered one of the people who kind of laid down the philosophy for the project of science as an endeavor in human society. So he also referred to a book of nature and the book of Revelation, which in that society, what they meant by that was the Bible. And it may be because of that, or a reference to that, there's an introduction to the philosophy of science written by Peter Coso, an American professor, that he called his book Reading the Book of Nature. He takes great pains to make it clear that he doesn't believe in God now, but for some reason he chose to call his book by that name. Now, another issue with regard to the Qur'an is that in the course of discussing prophethood, it also talks about things that happened in the past. And some of those also are, to one extent or another, verifiable. And so you have certain statements in the Qur'an which are subject to empirical testing regarding the natural world, and certain statements that are also amenable to investigation and scrutiny regarding facts about the past, about the human past. Now, the implication here is that most of the focus of Scripture is to show people their place in the world, their relationship with the Creator, how to develop a relationship with the Creator, and how to prepare for the afterlife. So a great deal of the kind of statements that are made on those subjects, there's no way that they can be empirically tested. Take, for example, the Quranic proposition that once you die, you're going to be in the grave for a period of time, and then there will be a day of judgment, and then people will either go to heaven or hell. Buddhism and Hinduism have a different proposition about what happens after death, that the soul returns to this world in a new body. So neither of those propositions is logically impossible, and neither of them can be proven or disproven empirically. We're going to take a break and come back. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're talking about scriptures and the kind of statements that they make about reality. Some of those statements cannot be empirically tested. For instance, what happens after death? And there's no way to determine empirically which of any of those scriptures is correct in those propositions based upon science or investigation of the visible world. None of that will yield us any kind of knowledge by which we could say, oh, the Islamic view is correct, or oh, the Buddhist view is correct. What scriptures also do, which we referred to earlier, is that they do make some statements about the visible world. And so those are subject to empirical verification or falsification. Now, with regard to scientific theories, some scientists have classified scientific theories into two major types. One is what's called nomological, which means like law-based, which is what we think of more as the natural sciences. They say that there are these laws that operate everywhere, and that given certain conditions, you can make predictions about what will happen. And so nomological theories, natural law-based theories, they have great predictive value. There's another kind of scientific theory that relates to some explanation about the past, so how things got the way they are. And those are extremely difficult to test, and their predictive abilities are not on the same level as these law-based theories. Another issue about science is that it's much easier to disprove an empirical theory than to prove it. Every time you find another example to confirm some theory about the way the world works, it adds a little more confirmation or a little bit of itmitnan, and serenity in the heart that this idea is probably correct. But how many cases does it take to disprove a theory? In theory, it only takes one counterexample in order to disprove a theory. If somebody said, based on their experience in Europe, all swans are white in color, and they find thousands of swans that are white, they would continue to increase in their certainty that that statement is correct. But then when people went to other parts of the world, they found that there are swans that are black in color. And so just finding one black swan would disprove that proposal. One of the things about materialism, and science takes a materialist position about the way to investigate reality. The way science is defined is that you have to look for material explanations. And the man I referred to earlier, Peter Casso, he says the standards of science require respect for the availability of information used to formulate or justify descriptions of the world. There can be no appeal to the unknowable. Justification cannot rely on factors beyond our understanding, lest the description descend to mysticism. And so he talks about ruling out the supernatural. He talks about ruling out, he says, organizing events under the ubiquitous will of a God, to cite another approach to describing the world that disregards scientific standards of using only available information, puts the account beyond our comprehension and even off limits to our attempts to understand it. So what he's saying is that you can't talk about God being a causative factor in the world because you can't demonstrate it. And some scientists, they call attention to a difference between methodological materialism and philosophical materialism. So this is a real key point. By its very nature, science must utilize methodological materialism, which is what Casa was talking about. It must investigate the world in terms of material entities and processes. However, such methodological materialism need not imply philosophical materialism. The scientifically untestable assertion that only material entities and processes exist. And this is a really key point. Because scientists use these material investigation all the time, become used to thinking in those terms, it's easy for them to forget that they're basing some part of their worldview on assumptions about reality which are beyond testing. And so the assumption that there is no God is just as positive and a proposition as the proposition that there is a God. And the atheist position that, we don't have to prove anything. You guys who believe in God are making a positive assertion about reality. The burden of proof is on you, not on us. This is something that has been challenged as a valid point of view because everybody makes certain assumptions about reality and then they build the rest of their worldview upon it. And one of the Darwinian scientist, Richard Lewontin, he admits this point. He says it's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. On the contrary, we're forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So it's like the metaphor of the man who's looking for a key. He's scratching around in the dirt, and somebody says, he's outside his house, and he's scratching around in the dirt, and a passerby said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm looking for my key." He said, "Where'd you lose it?" He said, "Inside the house." He said, "Why are you looking outside?" He said, "Well, there's more light here." So there are certain things that can be investigated materially, and there are certain things that cannot. And there are assumptions that cannot be proved for both parties. And if people forget that, then they start becoming intoxicated with what they think they know, and they come up with these really arrogant statements about reality and about God and about religion. So with regard to an Islamic methodology for dealing with investigations of the material world and reconciling them with Quranic statements about reality, one of the key concepts for this whole issue is dividing evidence into that which is qat'i and dhanni. So qat'i means, it comes from the word qat, just like the English word cut. So when we say in English something is cut and dry, it means it's a decided issue. So qat'i evidence means evidence that you're certain about. There's no doubt about it. And the other kind of evidence is dhanni. And dhanni means there's an element of uncertainty to it. And with regard to the Qur'an, we say that it's all qat'i in its authenticity, but some of it is qat'i in its indication, like what the words mean, and some of it is dhanni, means there's different levels of clarity of the wording of these verses. So some verses are crystal clear. There's no two ways to understand them. There's a lot of verses that conceivably there's more than one meaning, but one meaning is dominant. And then there's some verses that they're not clear in and of themselves. And with regard to scientific information about the world, this also falls into qat'i and dhanni. There are certain things which are proven. There's no way that an educated person can deny them. The earth goes around the sun. The sun doesn't go around the earth. I mean, that's established fact. The earth is round. It's not flat. It's established fact. So there are certain things that are established. They're qat'i. And there are other things which are dhanni. So Ibn Taymiyyah, he made this point, and Jafar Sheikh Idris, he reiterated it, said that when there is some kind of apparent contradiction between revelation and logical propositions and empirical, he identified three kinds of statements about reality. He said when there's any apparent contradiction between any of those three, that which is qat'i, which is certain evidence, it takes precedence, and that which is dhanni is overridden by it. And then there are certain kinds of, we look at dhanni evidence, not all dhanni evidence is on the same level of the strength of it. So it's at various levels of strength. And so that which is stronger takes precedence over that which is weaker. So what that implies is that if there's a contradiction between revelation and empirical knowledge, we have to look and see what is qat'i and what is dhanni. And we have to adjust our understanding either of what the text is saying or our deduction about what is going on in the material world in order to arrive at a consistent worldview. We've reached the end of this episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik.
اقرأ أخيا ورتل القرآن